In 1947, the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company extracted oil from Iranian soil, refined it at the largest refinery on earth, and sold it across the world. That year, the company reported after-tax profits of £40 million sterling. Iran received $7 million, not 7 million out of 40. 7 million out of a number that, once you factored in what Britain's treasury collected in taxes on those same profits, ran closer to 170 million. Iran was sitting on one of the most valuable deposits of oil on the planet, and it was receiving something between 4 and 9% of what that oil was worth on the open market. One man decided to count the ledger properly. His name was Mohammad Mossadegh. He was elected Prime Minister of Iran in 1951. He was Time magazine's Man of the Year, and he did something no Iranian leader had dared do before. He demanded to see the books. The company refused, so he nationalized the oil. The Iranian parliament voted unanimously. The International Court of Justice at The Hague ruled in Iran's favor. And Winston Churchill, newly returned as Prime Minister, went to Washington with a different plan entirely. By August 1953, Mossadegh was fleeing his own residence in his pajamas. 300 people were dead in the streets of Tehran. The Shah was back on the throne, and the company that had refused to open its books was about to be renamed. You know it today as BP. This is the sourced and declassified story of how one oil company, backed by the British government and financed by American intelligence, engineered the destruction of a democracy and set the template for a foreign policy playbook that did not stop in 1953. Before we open those books, this channel follows the money behind the events the history classes simplify, the profits, the coups, and the financial machinery that decided the fate of nations. If that's the history you want, subscribe before we go further. The numbers in this one have consequences that are still running. The story does not begin with Mossadegh. It begins in 1901 with a British engineer named William Knox D'Arcy and a piece of paper that would govern Iran's oil for the next 50 years. D'Arcy negotiated a concession from Persia's ruling Shah, giving him the exclusive right to prospect for oil across 480,000 square miles of Persian territory, roughly 5/6 of the entire country. In exchange, the Shah received £20,000 in cash, £20,000 in shares, and 16% of annual net profits. The deal ran for 60 years. Oil was discovered in 1908. The Anglo-Persian Oil Company was incorporated in 1909. And in 1914, on the eve of the First World War, the British government bought a 51% controlling stake for £2 million, securing guaranteed fuel supply for the Royal Navy at favorable prices and quietly converting a private oil venture into an instrument of state power. Winston Churchill, then First Lord of the Admiralty, was the architect of that purchase. He told Parliament that the investment would be worth far more than its cost in strategic terms. He was correct. The company grew into something colossal. By the late 1940s, its refinery at Abadan on the Persian Gulf was the largest in the world, processing more than 25 million tons of crude a year, a facility of such scale and complexity that it required its own internal railway network. Britain had effectively planted an industrial empire inside a sovereign nation, staffed at senior levels almost entirely by British nationals, under terms negotiated 5 decades earlier with a Shah who had no idea what the ground beneath his country was truly worth. The terms were never meaningfully revised, and the conditions for Iranian workers at Abadan told the same story in human terms. Iranian oil workers received wages of around 50 cents a day. There was no vacation pay, no sick leave, no disability compensation. They lived in a district called Kagazabad, Paper City, without running water or electricity. In winter, the ground flooded. Senior positions at the refinery went almost exclusively to British nationals who lived in a separate area with swimming pools, a club, and manicured gardens. The two communities, the British managers and the Iranian workers, lived side by side in conditions that could not have been more different, inside an installation that ran on Iranian oil extracted from Iranian ground. One British official later described the situation as a state within a state. That description was accurate, and it was not intended as a criticism. The 16% of the original D'Arcy concession had been renegotiated upward to a nominal profit-sharing arrangement in 1933, but the company retained the right to define what counted as profit, and it defined it narrowly. Overhead costs were allocated against Iranian operations. Profits from subsidiary companies outside Iran were excluded from the calculation. The result was that Iran's actual share of what its oil produced continued to shrink. By 1947, it had fallen to 9%. That same year, Standard Oil of New Jersey, one of the Rockefeller heirs, negotiated a 50-50 profit split with Venezuela. Britain was offering Iran less than a fifth of what America was offering Venezuela for comparable oil. The contrast was not lost on the Iranian parliament. Mohammad Mossadegh had been trying to audit the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company's accounts for years before he became Prime Minister. He was not a radical. He was a Swiss-educated lawyer from an aristocratic Iranian family, a constitutionalist who believed in parliamentary democracy and the rule of law. His argument was not that Britain was evil. It was that the concession was unfair and that Iran had every legal right under international law to know what was happening to its own natural resources. He wanted the books opened and the figures audited before any renegotiation. The company refused. The British government backed the refusal. Mossadegh won election to the Prime Ministry in April 1951 on essentially one platform: Iran's oil belongs to Iran. The Parliament, the Majlis, had already passed the nationalization bill unanimously. Mossadegh signed it into law on the 1st of May 1951. The National Iranian Oil Company was established. The Abadan refinery passed to Iranian ownership in law, if not yet in fact. Britain's immediate response was financial. It imposed a global boycott of Iranian oil, instructing tanker companies, refiners, and distributors across the world not to purchase Iranian crude on pain of legal action for handling stolen property. It was a clean, devastating instrument of economic warfare. Iran had nationalized its oil industry but had nowhere to sell what it produced. Within months, the revenue that had been funding the Iranian government had collapsed. The country was being strangled by a trading boycott enforced not by an army, but by British shipping lanes and British legal threats. The boycott was surgical. Iranian tankers left Abadan loaded with crude and found they could not offload at any Western port. The AIOC had issued legal warnings threatening buyers with action for handling nationalized property. The Iranian refinery, the largest in the world, ran at a fraction of its capacity because there were no customers for its output. Technicians and engineers, almost all British, walked off the job and departed the country. Iran was left with the infrastructure of an oil industry and no means of running it at scale or selling what it produced. Mossadegh went to the United Nations and spoke for 3 hours. He went to The Hague, where the International Court of Justice ruled that it had no jurisdiction over the nationalization, effectively validating Iran's legal right to its own resources. He went to Washington in 1951, where President Truman received him and pushed Britain to negotiate seriously. Britain would not negotiate seriously. It would offer formula changes and accounting adjustments that left the fundamental imbalance in place. What it would not offer was a genuine 50-50 split, the same terms that New Standard Oil had given Venezuela. The position was consistent, and the reason was not obscure. The chairman of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company told the British government plainly that accepting 50-50 profit-sharing with Iran would set a precedent that would unravel British oil interests across the Middle East. Kuwait, Iraq, the Gulf states? All the concessions would have to be renegotiated. The cost of a fair deal with Iran was not just Iran's oil. It was the entire architecture of British petroleum extraction. That calculation decided what happened next. Hold that figure, 9%. Iran was receiving 9% of what its own oil was worth, while Britain was collecting the rest through a company it controlled in a refinery it built on Iranian soil under a concession signed 50 years earlier for £20,000 cash. When the elected Prime Minister of a democratic nation said, "We want to see the accounts," the answer was a boycott and then something more permanent. In a moment, we follow the money into Washington and into the briefcase of a man traveling under a false name whose grandfather was President of the United States. Before a single CIA agent entered Iran, Britain had already deployed the most powerful weapon in its arsenal. Not a warship. A spreadsheet. The oil boycott, running from May 1951 through to the coup in August 1953, was a sustained act of financial warfare. In 1950, the last full year before nationalization, Iran's oil revenues had funded roughly a third of the government's entire budget. By 1952, that revenue had collapsed almost entirely. Iranian tankers sat loaded at Abadan with nowhere to offload. The refinery ran at a fraction of capacity. Foreign exchange reserves were draining. The government was cutting salaries, deferring payments, borrowing against nothing. The population that had cheered nationalization in May 1951 was living with the economic consequences of it by late 1952. That was the calculation. Britain did not need to invade Iran. It needed to make Iran ungovernable. And the boycott was doing exactly that, turning a popular democratic mandate into a grinding economic emergency that made Mossadegh's coalition fracture and his emergency powers look increasingly authoritarian. But Britain needed American help to convert that financial pressure into a permanent political outcome, and in 1951 and 1952, America was not willing to give it. President Truman and his Secretary of State Dean Acheson were not sympathetic to Britain's position. They could see that Mossadegh was a genuine Democrat and that the AIOC's terms were indefensible. They pressed Britain to negotiate seriously. Britain declined. The standoff continued through 1952, the boycott tightening, the Iranian economy deteriorating, Mossadegh governing through emergency powers as his political coalition began to fracture under the financial strain. Then, in November 1952, Dwight Eisenhower won the United States presidential election, and the calculation in London changed overnight. Eisenhower's incoming CIA director was Allen Dulles. His Secretary of State was John Foster Dulles, Allen's brother. Both men were cold warriors of a particular stripe, persuaded that any instability in a strategically important country was a Soviet opportunity waiting to be exploited. Britain presented Mossadegh not as a Democrat defending his country's oil revenue, but as a weak leader whose government might fall to the Soviet-backed Tudeh party. The enormous assets of Iranian oil production, Churchill told Eisenhower, could not be allowed to drift toward Moscow. The CIA's own internal assessments told a different story. A 1952 study concluded that a communist takeover in Iran was not imminent. A 1953 report reached nearly identical conclusions. The Tudeh party was not strong enough to seize power. Mossadegh was a nationalist, not a communist. He had, in fact, suppressed Tudeh demonstrations and kept the party at arm's length throughout his government. None of that changed the outcome. In March 1953, Eisenhower authorized the CIA to begin planning the removal of Mossadegh. The operation was given two names. The British called it Operation Boot. The Americans called it Operation Ajax. $1 million was wired to the CIA's Tehran station. The instruction, as Allen Dulles framed it, was to use that money in any way that would bring about the fall of Mossadegh. The instrument chosen was money. The same instrument that had been strangling Iran for 2 years, now redirected from the boycott into a covert political operation. $1 million was the budget. The man sent to spend it was Kermit Roosevelt Jr., grandson of President Theodore Roosevelt, Harvard-educated, traveling into Iran in July 1953 under a false name. Records declassified by the CIA and published by the National Security Archive confirm precisely how the money moved. Newspaper editors were paid to print fabricated anti-Mossadegh stories. Politicians were paid to withdraw their votes from the government. Clerics received cash payments to issue statements opposing the Prime Minister from the pulpit. Mob leaders were paid to organize street violence. In one operation confirmed in the released CIA files, men were hired specifically to pose as Mossadegh supporters while attacking religious figures. Engineering, the appearance that the Prime Minister's own backers were assaulting conservative Iranians. The budget for destabilizing a sovereign democracy was less than the AIOC made in profit in a single trading day. The American ambassador throughout this period told Mossadegh directly that the United States had no hostile intentions toward his government. The first coup attempt, on the night of August 15, 1953, failed. Mossadegh had been warned, and the coup-supporting general was arrested. The Shah fled, first to Baghdad, then to Rome. It appeared to be over. Roosevelt refused to leave. He spent the next 3 days reorganizing. More money was distributed. More crowds were hired. Military officers were approached. On August 19, the second attempt began. Pro-Shah mobs moved through Tehran, joined by tank units whose officers had been bought. By nightfall, after fighting that left an estimated 300 people dead in the streets, Mossadegh had fled his official residence. He surrendered the following day. Kermit Roosevelt drove to the royal palace and briefed the Shah on what had happened. Mossadegh was arrested, tried by military tribunal in a proceeding that drew international condemnation, and sentenced to 3 years in prison. He conducted his own defense, argued that he had acted legally under international law, and pointed out that the International Court of Justice had already ruled in Iran's favor. None of it changed the verdict. After serving his sentence, he was transferred to house arrest on his own estate at Ahmadabad, where he remained for the rest of his life. Not permitted to leave, not permitted to practice law, not permitted any political contact. He died in 1967 at the age of 84. His name was expunged from official Iranian history under the Shah. He remains one of the most consequential political figures of the 20th century, known to almost nobody in the countries that removed him. The total expenditure confirmed in the declassified CIA accounts was under $100,000, less than $250,000 allocated. The rest was unspent. The financial cost of removing a democratically elected government and preserving a £170 million annual oil extraction operation was less than the refinery at Abadan spent on maintenance in a week. That arithmetic, the cost of the coup versus the value of what the coup protected, is the purest financial statement in this entire story. The coup succeeded. Now the question was the oil. Britain could not simply restore the AIOC to its former position. The nationalization had been too public. the Iranian parliament's vote too unanimous, some face-saving arrangement was required. What was constructed in 1954 was a consortium, a group of companies that would operate the Iranian oil industry under a structure that gave Iran formal ownership and name, while distributing the actual profits through a framework Britain had helped design. The Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, renamed the British Petroleum Company in 1954 as if the old name carried too much of the story with it, received 40% of the consortium. Shell received 14%. The remaining 40% was distributed among 5 American oil companies: Standard Oil of New Jersey, Standard Oil California, Gulf Oil, Texaco, and Mobil. The negotiations over the new consortium arrangement took most of 1954. The Americans were insistent on one condition: they would participate, but the arrangement could not look like a simple restoration of British colonial control. The Iranians would need to receive the 50-50 split they had been demanding before the coup. Iran would maintain formal, nominal ownership of its oil resources. The operational reality, who extracted the oil, who refined it, who set the production quotas, who determined the pricing, would rest with the consortium companies. Iranian technicians and engineers would be trained, eventually, to fill more senior roles. The transition would take decades. The profit split that Mossadegh had demanded, 50-50, the same term Standard Oil had given Venezuela, was now implemented. But it was implemented without Mossadegh, without the parliament that had voted for nationalization, and without the democratic government that had tried to enforce Iran's legal rights. The terms Mossadegh had been removed for demanding were quietly granted to the government that replaced him. The Shah was back on the throne. American and British oil companies divided the concession, and the CIA had demonstrated for the first time that it could remove a democratically elected government through covert action at an affordable price. The proof came within 12 months. In 1954, a CIA operation code named PB Success removed the democratically elected president of Guatemala, Jacobo Arbenz, who had attempted to nationalize United Fruit Company land. The playbook was near identical: economic pressure, disinformation, paid mobs, a coup. The declassified CIA history of Operation Ajax was later described by its own authors as the blueprint that was handed to the Guatemala team. Tally the consequences, because this is the accounting that runs longest. For Britain, the immediate objective was achieved. The oil concession was preserved, the consortium was profitable, and the AIOC's rebranding to BP buried the corporate name most associated with the dispute. The Abadan crisis never became the precedent that would unravel British oil interests across the Gulf. The short-term balance sheet read as a success. For the United States, the immediate objective was also achieved. Iran remained in the Western camp. The Shah signed on to American Cold War policy. Military bases were available. Oil flowed. The price paid was $1 million and the destruction of one democratic government. By the accounting of 1953, it was considered cheap. For the architects of the operation, the professional rewards were considerable. Kermit Roosevelt returned to Washington and was offered, by his own later account, a senior position at the AIOC, which he declined. Allen Dulles briefed Eisenhower personally on the success of the operation. The CIA had proved that a covert financial operation, boycott to weaken, cash to corrupt, mobs to trigger, could accomplish what a war could not, at a fraction of the cost and with complete deniability. That lesson did not stay in a filing cabinet. For Iran, the price was a generation. The Shah's government, restored by foreign money and maintained by Western support, became increasingly authoritarian through the 1960s and 1970s. The Savaka, the secret police, was trained partly by the CIA. Dissent was suppressed. Political parties were banned. The Shah's modernization program created wealth for some and displacement for many. By 1979, the pressure had built beyond what the system could hold. The Islamic Revolution that followed installed Ayatollah Khomeini and defined the next half-century of Iranian politics, Iranian-American relations, and the political geography of the Middle East. When revolutionary students stormed the United States Embassy in Tehran in November 1979 and took 66 Americans hostage for 444 days, they called the building the Den of Spies. They were not using the phrase loosely. They had found, in the embassy's files, the documents from 1953. They knew what the building had been used for. The CIA formally admitted its role in the 1953 coup in 2013 when it declassified and released the internal history of Operation Ajax. The document states plainly that the military coup that overthrew Mossadegh was carried out under CIA direction as an act of United States foreign policy. The British government has never issued a formal apology. The Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, renamed BP, remains one of the largest corporations on Earth. Here is where the documented history connects to the present, not as opinion, but as a mechanism worth naming clearly. In 1951, a democratic government moved to control its own natural resources. A foreign power responded with an economic boycott designed to collapse the government's revenues. When the economy contracted and the political situation became unstable, a covert operation replaced the elected government with a compliant one. The new government signed the concession. The oil flowed. That is not an interpretation. It is the documented sequence of events in Iran in 1951 to 1953, confirmed by the CIA's own internal history, International Court of Justice proceedings, and the declassified National Security Archive files. The sequence has a shape. A sovereign government asserts control over a resource. External economic pressure is applied. Instability follows. A change of government resolves the dispute in favor of the external power. Iran is again under comprehensive economic sanctions. Its oil revenues are again suppressed by external pressure. Its government is again in a confrontation with Western powers over its sovereign choices. Whether the sequence of 1953 is visible in the present is a question this channel leaves to the viewer. The historical record is what it is. The story you were taught about 1953, if it was taught at all, frames it as a Cold War necessity, a pragmatic response to the threat of Soviet expansion. The ledger frames it differently as the documented removal of a democratic government by foreign intelligence services at the request of an oil company that refused to open its accounts in order to preserve a profit-sharing arrangement that gave Iran 9% of its own oil. The receipts are in the declassified files. They have been there since 2013. Mossadegh, when he addressed the United Nations Security Council in 1951, said something that was reported at the time and then largely forgotten. He told the Council that Iran was not asking for charity or sympathy. It was asking for the application of the same principles of sovereignty and self-determination that the Western powers proclaimed as the foundation of the post-war international order. It was asking, he said, to count what was taken from its ground and to receive a fair share of it. The Security Council referred the matter back to direct negotiations. The negotiations failed. Britain imposed the boycott. The CIA organized the coup. And the principles of sovereignty that Mossadegh cited, the principles that the United Nations Charter guaranteed to every member state, were suspended for 9% of the profits from an oil field in the Persian Gulf. If this is the kind of history that matters to you, the version written in concession agreements and CIA budgets instead of the version in the textbooks, subscribe, because every video on this channel follows the money the same way. There is a financial story behind almost every political event you think you understand. The documents are usually there. We'll keep reading them together.